There are moments that change a man forever, and for Sheriff Clay Hartwell, it came in the form of a 7-year-old girl's broken whisper. She stood on the courthouse steps, clutching a torn doll, her small voice cutting through 23 years of law enforcement experience. "My uncle hurt me again." The words hit Clay harder than any bullet he'd ever dodged. This wasn't just any uncle. This was Thomas Brennan, church deacon, cattle rancher, and member of one of Cedar Ridge's founding families. In a town where blood runs thicker than justice, Clay faced an impossible choice: protect the child and tear apart the community that trusted him, or stay silent like he did years ago when his own sister needed him most. The girl looked up at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. How do you arrest a man whose family built half the town when everyone expects you to look the other way? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sheriff Clay Hartwell had walked these dusty streets of Cedar Ridge for 23 years, watching the town grow from a rough cattle settlement into something resembling civilization. At 52, his weathered face bore the lines of a man who'd seen enough human nature to understand that good and evil rarely wore clear labels. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as he made his usual rounds, nodding to shop owners opening their doors and exchanging pleasantries with the early risers heading to work. Cedar Ridge sat in a valley between rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon like a faded photograph. The town had been built by 3 founding families in 1887, the Brennans, the Caldwells, and the Hatchers, and their descendants still controlled most of the land, business, and politics that kept the place running. Population had grown to just over 3,000 souls, enough to support a proper courthouse, a hospital, 3 churches, and a main street lined with the kinds of businesses that served ranching folk: feed stores, a hardware shop, and Betty's diner, where the coffee was strong and the gossip stronger. Clay's office occupied the ground floor of the courthouse, a 2-story brick building that the town took considerable pride in. His desk, scarred by decades of use, sat beneath a window that gave him a clear view of the street. This morning, like every morning for the past 2 decades, he'd arrived before 7 and started his day by reading through incident reports and checking in with his night deputy. The routine gave him comfort. In a world that seemed to spin faster each year, Cedar Ridge maintained the steady rhythm of a place where people still knew their neighbors and left their doors unlocked. But comfort, Clay had learned, was a luxury that could be stripped away in an instant. Deputy Maria Santos knocked on his doorframe, holding a steaming cup of coffee. At 31, she was the first Hispanic officer Cedar Ridge had ever hired, and she'd proven herself capable and level-headed during her 4 years on the force. "Morning, Sheriff." "Quiet night. Just Bob Henderson sleeping one off in the drunk tank again." His wife still throwing him out. Clay accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma, every Friday like clockwork. "She'll be here this afternoon to collect him," apologizing for the trouble. Maria settled into the chair across from his desk. "You know, in Houston, domestic calls were the most dangerous part of the job. Here, it's mostly just sad." Clay had hired Maria, partly because she'd seen the wider world, worked patrol in a city where violence was measured in body counts rather than broken noses from Saturday night fights. Her perspective helped him understand how fortunate Cedar Ridge had been, insulated from the harsher realities that plagued larger communities. Yet that insulation sometimes bred a dangerous complacency, a belief that certain kinds of evil simply didn't exist in their small corner of the world. "Speaking of families," Maria continued, "I saw Emma Brennan walking to school yesterday with a pretty nasty bruise on her arm. Told me she fell off her bike, but..." Clay set down his coffee, giving her his full attention. "Kids don't usually fall off bikes in perfect finger-shaped patterns." The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Clay felt something cold settle in his stomach, a familiar dread he'd been carrying since childhood. Emma Brennan was Thomas Brennan's niece, the daughter of his younger brother, who died in a ranch accident 3 years ago. She'd been living with Thomas and his wife ever since, along with their own 2 boys. You talked to the school nurse? She noticed it too. Says Emma's been withdrawn lately, not playing with the other kids like she used to. Maria's expression was carefully neutral, but Clay could see the concern in her dark eyes. Could be grief, losing a parent that young. Could be. Clay reached into his desk drawer, his fingers brushing against an envelope he kept there. Yellow with age. His name written in his sister Sarah's careful handwriting. He'd received the letter 3 days before her suicide 28 years ago, and he'd never opened it, afraid of what truths it might contain. Keep an eye on her, would you? Discreetly. Maria nodded and rose to leave, then paused at the door. Sheriff? In Houston, we learned that the worst crimes often happen in the nicest neighborhoods, behind the prettiest facades. Evil doesn't announce itself with neon signs. After she left, Clay pulled out the letter. The envelope was addressed to him in care of the Dallas Police Academy, where he'd been training when Sarah took her own life at 19. Their parents had forwarded it, but he'd shoved it in a drawer and tried to forget it existed. Over the years, it had followed him from job to job, desk to desk, a reminder of his failure to protect the one person who'd needed him most. Sarah had been 15 when the whispers started, neighbors talking about how much time she spent with their Uncle Raymond, their mother's brother who'd moved in after losing his job. Clay, 18 and focused on his own future, had dismissed the talk as small-town gossip. When Sarah began having nightmares and begging not to be left alone with Raymond, Clay had thought she was being dramatic. Teenagers, he'd told himself, were naturally emotional. The day before he left for the academy, Sarah had pulled him aside, tears streaming down her face. Clay, I need to tell you something about Uncle Raymond. He's been... But their mother had called them for dinner, and the moment had passed. Sarah had smiled and said it could wait until he got back. She never got the chance to try again. Now, 28 years later, Clay understood the weight of silence. The price of looking away when looking closer might reveal uncomfortable truths. Cedar Ridge prided itself on being a place where families took care of their own, where private matters stayed private. But privacy, Clay had learned, was too often just another word for secrecy. And secrecy was where evil flourished. Thomas Brennan was everything Cedar Ridge admired in a man. Successful, respected, deeply involved in community affairs. He'd inherited the largest ranch in the county from his father and had tripled its size through shrewd business dealings. He served as a deacon at First Baptist Church, donated generously to local charities, and employed half the town directly or indirectly. When people talked about Thomas Brennan, they used words like pillar and foundation, the kind of man who kept Cedar Ridge stable and prosperous. Clay had known Thomas since they were boys, had watched him grow from a privileged kid into a powerful, a man. They'd never been friends exactly. Thomas had always carried himself with the casual arrogance that came from knowing your family owned half the world you lived in. But they'd maintained the cordial relationship that small-town politics required. Thomas supported Clay's campaigns for sheriff, and Clay made sure the Brennan Ranch got the same protection as any other property in his jurisdiction. The relationship was professional, predictable, and built on mutual respect for boundaries. Thomas didn't interfere with Clay's job, and Clay didn't pry into Thomas's business beyond what the law required. It was a comfortable arrangement that had served them both well for over 2 decades. But comfort, Clay was beginning to understand, was sometimes the enemy of justice. Mayor Jim Caldwell knocked on the courthouse door just after 9, his round face flushed from the morning heat. A third-generation politician whose grandfather had helped write Cedar Ridge's original town charter, Jim understood power as an inheritance rather than a responsibility. He was a good man in most ways, honest with the town's money, concerned about infrastructure, genuinely interested in improving life for his constituents. But he was also a man who believed that maintaining harmony was more important than disturbing peace, even when that peace was built on willful blindness. "Morning, Clay. Thought we should touch base about the Henderson situation. His wife's threatening to press charges this time." "She's got every right to. Man hits his wife, he faces the consequences." "True, but Bob employs 12 men at his construction company. If he goes to jail, those families lose their income." Jim settled his bulk into Maria's chair, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Maybe we could work something out. Counseling, community service, something that doesn't put him out of business." Clay studied the mayor's earnest face, recognizing the logic that had governed Cedar Ridge for generations. Economic stability trumped individual justice. Community reputation mattered more than personal accountability. Keep the peace. Protect the jobs. Maintain the facade of respectability that attracted new businesses and kept young families from moving away. "I'll consider it," Clay said, knowing he wouldn't. "Jim, let me ask you something. If you suspected someone prominent in town was hurting a child, what would you do?" The mayor's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "That's a hell of a hypothetical question, Clay. Why would you ask something like that?" "Just wondering how we balance protecting individuals against protecting the community's reputation." "Well, I suppose," Jim paused, clearly uncomfortable. "I suppose we'd have to be very careful. Make sure we had solid evidence before making accusations that could destroy an innocent man's life. False allegations can tear a community apart, ruin reputations that took generations to build. And if the allegations were true, then we'd handle it quietly, professionally, work with the family to get everyone the help they need without turning it into a public spectacle. That's what good leadership looks like, solving problems without creating bigger ones." After Jim left, Clay sat in the growing heat of the day and considered the weight of leadership, the difference between keeping peace and pursuing justice. In 30 minutes, he'd had 2 conversations that revealed the challenge he faced. Maria urging him to look closer at potential abuse, Jim cautioning him to prioritize community stability over individual concerns. Both perspectives had merit. Both came from people he trusted, and both pointed toward the kind of impossible choice that had haunted him since Sarah's death. The torn doll the little girl had clutched wasn't just a child's toy. It was a symbol of innocence, damaged, of trust, broken, of the vulnerability that adults were supposed to protect. Clay could see it in his mind's eye, the way the fabric had been worn thin from too much handling, the way one arm hung by a few threads, the way the girl had held it like a lifeline in a world that had suddenly become dangerous. He thought about Sarah's doll, a porcelain beauty their grandmother had given her for her 8th birthday. After Raymond moved in, Sarah had stopped playing with it, had stuffed it in the back of her closet where it couldn't watch what was happening to her. Clay had found it after her funeral, still hidden away, and had wondered why she'd abandoned something she'd once treasured. Now he understood. Some damage was too painful to witness, even from a toy that couldn't judge or betray or fail to protect what needed protecting most. Clay's hands trembled slightly as he knelt beside Emma on the courthouse steps, his voice gentler than he'd ever made it. "Sweetheart, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Can you do that for me?" Emma clutched her torn doll closer, the fabric worn smooth from countless nights of seeking comfort in its cotton embrace. She was small for 7, with Thomas Brennan's distinctive blue eyes, but none of his confident bearing. Instead, she carried herself like someone who'd learned that the world was full of sudden movements and loud voices, that safety was temporary, and trust was dangerous. "He said I couldn't tell anybody," she whispered, her voice so quiet Clay had to lean closer to hear. "He said it was our special secret, and bad things would happen if I told. Emma, I'm the sheriff. My job is to keep people safe, especially little girls like you. Nobody's going to hurt you for telling the truth, I promise." Dr. Rebecca Hayes arrived within 10 minutes of Clay's call, her medical bag in one hand and a gentle expression that had comforted Cedar Ridge's children for 15 years. She was 43, unmarried by choice, and had dedicated her life to healing in a community that sometimes preferred to pretend certain kinds of wounds didn't exist. She'd seen enough in her years of practice to recognize the signs Clay was describing, and she approached Emma with the careful movements of someone who understood that trust, once broken, was fragile as spun glass. "Hello, Emma," Sheriff Hartwell. "Ed called me because he's worried about you. Would it be okay if we went inside, where it's cooler, and talked for a little while?" The medical examination took place in Dr. Hayes's clinic, a converted house on Elm Street that smelled of antiseptic and the lavender soap she used to calm nervous patients. Clay waited in the front office, studying the certificates on her wall, and trying not to think about what Emma was enduring in the examination room. The torn doll sat on the desk where Emma had placed it, and Clay found himself staring at its button eyes, wondering what horrors those lifeless features had witnessed. When Dr. Hayes emerged 45 minutes later, her face was pale but professionally composed. She gestured for Clay to follow her into her private office, closing the door behind them with the careful precision of someone delivering news that would change everything. "The physical evidence is consistent with sexual abuse," she said without a preamble, settling behind her desk with the weariness of someone who'd delivered too many such diagnoses. "Multiple incidents over an extended period. The psychological indicators are textbook: dissociation, hypervigilance, inappropriate sexual knowledge for her age." Clay felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. The same sensation he'd experienced years ago when the call came about Sarah. "How long?" "Based on what I observed and what she was able to tell me, I'd estimate at least 6 months, possibly longer." Dr. Hayes opened Emma's file, her hands steady despite the gravity of what she was documenting. "I've made detailed notes and taken photographs for evidence. I'm legally required to report this to Child Protective Services, but I wanted you to know first." "What did she tell you?" "Her uncle has been sexually abusing her, usually when his wife is away from the house. He's told her it's normal, that all uncles do this with their nieces, and that terrible things will happen to her and her cousins if she tells anyone." Dr. Hayes' voice remained clinical, but Clay could see the anger burning in her eyes. "She's been carrying this alone for months, Clay. A 7-year-old child, believing she's protecting other children by staying silent about her own abuse." The drive to the Brennan ranch took 20 minutes on roads that cut through rolling pasture land dotted with cattle. Clay had made this trip hundreds of times over the years, responding to calls about stolen equipment, investigating reports of trespassers, attending the occasional barbecue when community relations required his presence. The ranch was impressive by any standard, sprawling across 5,000 acres with a main house that could have belonged to European nobility and outbuildings that housed millions of dollars in equipment and livestock. Thomas Brennan was waiting on his front porch when Clay's patrol car pulled up the circular drive, as if he'd been expecting this visit. At 55, he was still an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room. He wore pressed jeans and a white button-down shirt, his boots polished despite the ranch, setting every inch the successful businessman who'd built his family's legacy into an empire. "Afternoon, Clay. What brings you out here on such a beautiful day?" Clay climbed the porch steps slowly, his hand resting unconsciously on his service weapon. In 23 years of law enforcement, he'd faced armed robbers and drunken ranchers. With less tension than he felt now, approaching this man who'd attended his swearing-in ceremony and contributed to his campaign fund. "Thomas, I need to talk to you about Emma. Some serious allegations have been made." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a calculation, a measuring of options. "Allegations? What kind of allegations?" "The kind that require a formal investigation." I'm going to need you to come to the station. You'd for questioning. Now, Clay, you know that's not how things work around here. Thomas settled into a rocking chair, his movements casual, but his voice carrying the subtle weight of authority. Emma's been having a hard time since her father died. Kids her age sometimes make up stories to get attention, to make sense of trauma they don't understand. Surely we can handle this as a family matter. Sexual abuse isn't a family matter, Thomas. It's a crime. The words hung between them like a challenge, and Clay watched Thomas's facade of neighborly concern slip just enough to reveal something harder underneath. This wasn't a man who was used to being told no, especially not by someone he considered an employee of the community he'd helped build. That's a serious accusation, Sheriff. The kind that can destroy a man's reputation, even if it's completely false. Thomas stood slowly, his height advantage suddenly seeming deliberate. The kind that can destroy a sheriff's career if he's not very careful about the truth. I'm not concerned about my career right now, Thomas. I'm concerned about a little girl who's been hurt. By whom? Who's making these allegations? Because if it's that new deputy of yours, the one from Houston, I think we both know she's got her own agenda. City folk sometimes see problems where none exist, especially when they're looking to make a name for themselves. Clay felt his jaw tighten. The deflection was smooth, practiced, the kind of response that suggested Thomas had weathered accusations before. The allegations come from Emma herself, supported by medical evidence. This isn't going away, Thomas. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across 23 years of professional courtesy and mutual respect. Then Thomas smiled, the expression cold as winter wind. Medical evidence can be misinterpreted, Clay. Child testimony is notoriously unreliable. You're building a case on the fantasies of a traumatized little girl, and when this falls apart, and it will fall apart, you'll have destroyed not just my family, but your own career and this community's faith in its law enforcement. He paused, letting the threat sink in. My family has been good to this town, good to you. We've supported your campaigns, your department's budget, your wife's charity work. Don't let misplaced idealism destroy relationships that have taken decades to build. Clay descended the porch steps, with Thomas's words echoing in his ears, the weight of the man's influence suddenly crystal clear. The Brennan family didn't just own land and cattle. They owned mortgages and jobs, and the economic foundation that kept Cedar Ridge functioning. Thomas wasn't just threatening Clay's career, he was threatening the livelihood of everyone who depended on the Brennan empire for their survival. Back at the courthouse, Clay found Deputy Santos waiting with Emma's mother, Jennifer Brennan. She was 32, but looked older, worn down by grief and the struggle of raising a daughter alone, on a ranch hand's widow pension. She sat in the chair across from Clay's desk, with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes red from crying. Mrs. Brennan, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions about Emma and your brother-in-law. Jennifer's composure cracked immediately. I knew something was wrong. She stopped sleeping through the night, started having accidents again. She wouldn't let me leave her alone with Thomas, always made excuses. I hoped it was just grief, losing her daddy so young. Did you ever see anything that made you suspicious? Thomas was always good to us after Daniel died. He let us stay in the foreman's house rent-free, made sure Emma had everything she needed. He said family takes care of family. Her voice broke on the last word. I depended on him, Sheriff. Financially, emotionally. I didn't know how to survive without his help. When Emma started acting strange around him, I told myself I was imagining things because I couldn't afford to believe otherwise. Clay leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Mrs. Brennan, Emma is going to need professional help to recover from this, and she's going to need a mother who believes her and protects her no matter what it costs. Jennifer wiped her eyes with a tissue Maria had provided. What happens now? Thomas controls everything, our housing, my job, Emma's school fund. If I stand against him, we'll lose everything. But if I don't, she looked up at Clay with desperate eyes. How do I choose between my daughter's safety and our survival? It was the question that struck at the heart of Thomas Brennan's power, the economic control that made resistance seem impossible, that turned victims into accomplices in their own oppression. Clay thought about Sarah, about all the ways their family had depended on Uncle Raymond's contributions to the household, about how speaking up would have meant financial catastrophe for people already living on the edge of poverty. "We'll figure out the practical details," Clay promised, though he wasn't sure how. Right now, Emma needs to know that the adults in her life are going to protect her, even when it's hard. As evening fell over Cedar Ridge, Clay sat in his office, reviewing the medical report Dr. Hayes had prepared. The clinical language couldn't soften the brutality of what Emma had endured, the systematic destruction of a child's trust and innocence by someone who was supposed to protect her. The torn doll sat on his desk like a silent witness, its button eyes reflecting the lamplight as Clay tried to plan his next move against a man who held the town's economic future in his hands. The first threatening note was slipped under his office door sometime after midnight, a single sheet of paper with words cut from magazine letters. Some secrets should stay buried. Clay stared at the crude message, understanding that Thomas Brennan's influence extended beyond economics into the darker corners of intimidation and fear. 28 years after failing his sister, Clay Hartwell faced the same impossible choice that had haunted him ever since: stand up to powerful men who hurt children or look the other way to preserve the peace. This time, with Emma's torn doll serving as a reminder of innocence destroyed and a little girl's courage in speaking truth to power, he knew there was only one choice he could live with. The gossip started before Clay finished his morning coffee, rippling through Cedar Ridge with the efficiency of a telegraph system built on shared glances and whispered conversations. By 10 o'clock, Betty's diner was buzzing with speculation about why the sheriff had visited the Brennan ranch and what it might mean for the town's most prominent family. The conversation stopped abruptly when Clay entered for his usual Tuesday breakfast, the silence heavy with unspoken questions and barely concealed judgment. Betty Martinez, who'd been serving coffee and collecting secrets for 30 years, approached his usual booth with the careful neutrality she reserved for potentially explosive situations. "Morning, Sheriff, the usual. Just coffee today, Betty." Black. She poured without comment, but Clay could feel the weight of every gaze in the diner. These were people who'd voted for him, trusted him to maintain the delicate balance that kept Cedar Ridge peaceful and prosperous. Now they were wondering if that trust had been misplaced, if their sheriff was about to upset the economic apple cart that provided their livelihoods. Mayor Caldwell appeared at Clay's table within minutes, his round face flushed with anxiety and perspiration. He slid into the booth across from Clay with the urgency of a man trying to prevent a disaster. "Clay, we need to talk privately. There are rumors flying around town and people are getting nervous." "What kind of rumors, Jim?" "The kind that suggest you're investigating Thomas Brennan over some family matter that should be handled discreetly." The mayor lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but Thomas called me this morning. He's concerned that you might be pursuing something based on unreliable information, and he wanted me to remind you how important the Brennan family is to this community's economic stability." Clay sipped his coffee, studying the mayor's earnest face. Jim Caldwell wasn't a bad man, but he was a political creature who measured every decision against its potential impact on his own survival. In his world, perception mattered more than truth, and stability trumped justice when the two came into conflict. "Jim, if someone was hurting a child, what would you want me to do about it?" The mayor's face went pale. "Jesus, Clay, are you saying is this about child abuse? I'm asking what you'd want me to do if it was. I'd want you to follow proper procedures, work with Child Protective Services, handle it through official channels without creating unnecessary drama." The mayor paused, his political instincts warring with his conscience. "But I'd also want you to be absolutely certain before you destroyed a good man's reputation over allegations that might not hold up in court." After the mayor left, Clay drove to the courthouse and spent 2 hours in the basement archives, pulling files that hadn't seen daylight in years. The town council minutes from 1962 through 1995 painted a fascinating picture of the Brennan family's growing influence, how their opinions on zoning matters carried unusual weight, how their business partnerships seemed to receive favorable treatment, how complaints against Brennan Enterprises had a tendency to disappear from official records. The pattern was subtle but consistent. The Brennans didn't just participate in Cedar Ridge's governance, they shaped it. Road improvements always seemed to benefit their properties first. Environmental concerns about their ranching practices were quietly shelved. When other businesses struggled with permit applications, Brennan Ventures sailed through the approval process without delay. Most telling were the gaps, incidents referenced in meeting minutes that had no corresponding police reports, complaints mentioned in passing that never appeared in official documentation. Someone had been very careful to scrub the record clean, to create the appearance of a family whose success was built on nothing more controversial than hard work and good business sense. Clay was deep in a 1987 file when someone knocked on the archive door. He looked up to find Maggie Hatcher, the town's unofficial historian and keeper of uncomfortable memories. At 78, she was one of the few people old enough to remember when the three founding families had been equals, rather than the current hierarchy that placed the Brennans firmly on top. "Sheriff Hartwell, I heard you were down here digging through old files. Mind if I join you?" Maggie settled into a dusty chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones had earned their aches through decades of living. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and the kind of memory that made her both valuable and dangerous in a community that preferred its history sanitized. "Maggie, what can you tell me about the Brennan family's history in Cedar Ridge?" "Depends on whether you want the official version or the truth." She smiled grimly, her gnarled hands folding in her lap. "The official version is that they're pillars of the community, generous benefactors who've helped build everything from the hospital to the high school. The truth is more complicated." "How complicated?" Old Thomas, the current Thomas's grandfather, was a hard man who believed rules applied to other people. When the railroad came through in 1923, he somehow managed to buy up the best land at below-market prices just before the route was announced. When the county built the new highway in 1954, it conveniently bypassed his property instead of running through it like the original survey suggested. Maggie pulled a manila folder from her worn purse, the paper yellowed with age. "I've been keeping my own records for 50 years, Sheriff. Family histories, business dealings, the kind of information that sometimes disappears from official files. The Brennans have a pattern. They take care of their own interests first, and they take care of anyone who might interfere with those interests." The folder contained newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photocopied documents that painted a different picture of Cedar Ridge's most respected family. Stories of business partners forced out under suspicious circumstances, competitors whose enterprises failed after running afoul of Brennan interests, officials whose careers ended abruptly after asking inconvenient questions. There were rumors about the current Thomas's father, too, Maggie continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Young women who worked at the ranch, complaints that never seemed to go anywhere. Girls who left town suddenly, families who moved away without explanation. Nothing you could prove in court, but patterns you couldn't ignore if you were paying attention. Clay studied a faded news clipping about a ranch hand's daughter who'd accused the elder Brennan of assault in 1978. The charges had been dropped after she recanted her statement, and the family had moved to Arizona a week later. According to Maggie's notes, the girl's father had received a substantial settlement from the Brennan Ranch for unspecified workplace injuries. "Why are you telling me this now, Maggie?" "Because I'm old enough to remember when good people stayed silent while bad things happened, and I've regretted it every day since." She stood slowly, her joints protesting the movement. That little girl deserves better than our collective cowardice, Sheriff. And this town deserves to finally face the truth about the family that's been controlling it for 3 generations. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Carol Peterson, was waiting in the school parking lot when Clay arrived that afternoon. She was a 30-year veteran of Cedar Ridge Elementary, the kind of educator who noticed everything and forgot nothing about the children in her care. Her face was drawn with worry as she approached Clay's patrol car. "Sheriff, I'm glad you came. Emma hasn't been herself for months. And after what happened yesterday, I think you need to know what I've observed." They sat in her empty classroom, surrounded by the cheerful decorations and student artwork that made elementary schools feel like sanctuaries of innocence. Mrs. Peterson pulled out a folder thick with documentation, drawings Emma had made, written, assignments that revealed troubling themes, behavioral observations that painted a picture of a child in distress. "Look at this," she said, spreading Emma's drawings across her desk. 6 months ago, Emma drew typical 7-year-old pictures, rainbows, flowers, happy families. Then something changed. The newer drawings were darker, full of shadowy figures and frightened children. One showed a small girl hiding in a closet while a larger figure loomed outside. Another depicted a house with all the windows blacked out. Most disturbing was a crayon drawing of a man and child, the man's hands positioned in ways that no 7-year-old should understand without experiencing them firsthand. She's been falling asleep in class, having trouble concentrating, startling whenever someone touches her shoulder. Classic signs of trauma that I've learned to recognize over 30 years of teaching. Mrs. Peterson's voice carried the weight of too many children she'd watched suffer in silence. I reported my concerns to the principal twice, but he said we needed to be careful about making accusations against prominent families without absolute proof. What about the other children? Thomas's own sons? That's the strange part. His boys seem fine, normal, happy, well-adjusted. If there was general abuse in the household, you'd expect to see signs in all the children. This appears to be targeted specifically at Emma. Clay thought about predators who understood the importance of selecting vulnerable victims, children without strong family support, kids who were dependent on their abusers for basic survival, girls who could be isolated from potential allies. Emma fit the profile perfectly. Orphaned, financially dependent, living in a household where her uncle's word was law and questioning his authority could mean homelessness. The afternoon brought Clay's first real ally in an unexpected form. Dr. Rebecca Hayes called to report that she'd been contacted by 2 other women, both adults now, who'd heard about Emma's situation and wanted to share their own experiences with Thomas Brennan. They were willing to provide statements if it would help protect Emma from what they'd endured decades earlier. "I can't give you their names over the phone," Dr. Hayes explained, "but they've agreed to meet with you tomorrow, if you can guarantee their confidentiality during the investigation phase. They understand that their testimony might eventually become public if this goes to trial." That evening, Clay sat in his home office reviewing the day's revelations, while his wife Margaret worked on her cross-stitch in the chair beside his desk. They'd been married for 27 years, and she knew his moods well enough to recognize when he was wrestling with something that went beyond ordinary police work. "It's about that little girl, isn't it? The Brennan child." Margaret's voice was gentle, understanding. She'd grown up in Cedar Ridge too, had witnessed the same willful blindness that allowed certain kinds of secrets to flourish unchallenged. "Margaret, if pursuing this case means I lose my job, maybe face retaliation from the most powerful family in town, would you still support my decision?" She set down her needlework and studied his face, with the kind of attention that comes from nearly 3 decades of marriage. "Clay Hartwell, I married a man who became a sheriff because he wanted to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. If you can look at an abused child and walk away to preserve your career, then you're not the man I married." The anonymous, threatening note slipped under their front door, sometime after midnight, was more specific than the first. Drop the investigation or face the consequences. You have 48 hours. Clay found it when he went outside to retrieve the morning paper, the crude cut-and-paste letters spelling out a threat that was both cowardly and chilling. Standing in his front yard at dawn, looking across the town he'd sworn to protect, Clay understood that he'd reached a point of no return. Thomas Brennan had made his position clear, and backing down now would mean abandoning Emma to continued abuse while sending a message to other victims that justice was for sale to the highest bidder. The torn doll Emma had clutched on the courthouse. Steps sat on Clay's desk, like a silent witness, its button eyes reflecting the morning light streaming through his office window. He'd asked Dr. Hayes to let Emma keep it during her interviews, understanding instinctively that the child needed something familiar to hold on to as her world fell apart around her. Clay picked up the phone and dialed the state attorney general's office. It was time to bring in resources that couldn't be intimidated by local influence, investigators who didn't depend on the Brennan family for their livelihoods. Whatever Thomas Brennan's 48-hour ultimatum might bring, Clay intended to meet it with the full force of the law behind him. Clay found the diary purely by accident. He'd returned to his childhood home to collect some of his mother's belongings. She'd passed 6 months earlier, and he'd been putting off the painful task of sorting through a lifetime's accumulation of memories, hidden behind a loose board. In what had been Sarah's closet, wrapped in a faded pillowcase, was a small leather-bound book he'd never seen before. Sarah's handwriting filled the pages, documenting 2 years of hell in the careful script their mother had taught her. The entries began when Sarah was 13, shortly after Uncle Raymond moved into their spare room. They chronicled a systematic campaign of grooming and abuse that had escalated from inappropriate comments to physical violations that Sarah described, in the heartbreaking detail of a child trying to make sense of incomprehensible betrayal. March 15, 1984. Uncle Raymond said all men need special attention from the women in their family. He said it's normal, and I shouldn't tell anyone because they wouldn't understand. June 22, 1984. He hurt me again last night. I tried to tell Mama, but she said I was being dramatic and that Uncle Raymond was going through a hard time. She said good Christian girls help their family however they can. October 3, 1984. Clay came home from football practice early and almost caught us. Uncle Raymond said if Clay found out, it would destroy our family and Clay would blame himself. Forever. He said it was better to keep our secret. January 18, 1985. I think about dying sometimes, not because I want to hurt anyone, but because it's the only way I can think of to make this stop. Maybe if I'm gone, Uncle Raymond won't hurt anyone else. The final entry was dated 3 days before Sarah's suicide. I wrote Clay a letter, telling him everything. Maybe when he reads it, he'll understand why I couldn't stay. Maybe it will help him protect other girls from men like Uncle Raymond. I hope he can forgive me for not being stronger. Clay's hands shook as he closed the diary, 28 years of guilt and regret, crystallizing into a single moment of terrible clarity. Sarah had tried to protect him from knowledge that would hurt him, just as she'd tried to protect their family from scandal that would destroy them. Her silence hadn't been cowardice. It had been a 13-year-old girl's attempt to bear an unbearable burden alone. The letter she'd mentioned sat in his desk drawer back at the courthouse, still unopened after all these years. Clay had been afraid to read it, afraid of what truths it might contain about his failure to protect her. Now he understood that Sarah's final communication hadn't been an accusation. It had been a gift, information that might help him save other children from the hell she'd endured. Dr. Rebecca Hayes was waiting in her office when Clay arrived with the diary, her face grave with the weight of secrets she'd been carrying for 15 years of medical practice in Cedar Ridge. She'd agreed to meet with the 2 adult survivors who'd contacted her, and their stories had confirmed Clay's worst fears about the scope of Thomas Brennan's crimes. The first woman is 34 now, a successful attorney in Dallas. She lived on the Brennan Ranch when she was 8 through 10. Her father was the foreman before he died in what was ruled an accidental fall from the barn loft. She's willing to testify that Thomas abused her regularly during those 2 years, and that his father covered it up by paying her mother to relocate the family to Oklahoma. Clay felt his stomach clench. And the second woman? She's 41, a nurse practitioner in Austin. Her family worked for the Brennans when she was 12. She says Thomas raped her in the barn during a church social, and when she told her parents, Thomas convinced them she was lying to get attention. The family left Cedar Ridge a month later when their employment was mysteriously terminated. The pattern was becoming clear. Thomas Brennan was a serial predator who used his family's economic power to silence victims and cover up crimes. He selected vulnerable children from families who depended on Brennan employment, abused them systematically, then used financial pressure to ensure their silence or drive them away from potential support systems. There's something else, Dr. Hayes continued, pulling a manila folder from her desk drawer. I've been documenting suspicious injuries and behavioral changes in children from families employed by the Brennans for years. I never had enough evidence to make formal reports, but the patterns were troubling enough that I kept detailed records. The files contained medical notes on 7 children spanning the past decade, unexplained genital trauma, behavioral regression, sleep disorders, and academic problems that coincided with their families' employment at Brennan Properties. None of the children had disclosed abuse directly, but the medical evidence suggested systematic victimization that had been carefully concealed. Why didn't you report this earlier? Clay asked, though he already knew the answer. Because Thomas Brennan serves on the hospital board of directors and controls the largest source of charitable funding for our clinic. Because half my patients work for him directly or indirectly. Because I've seen what happens to people who cross the Brennan family. They lose their jobs, their homes, their ability to survive in this community. Dr. Hayes's voice carried the weight of years of moral compromise. I told myself that documenting everything was enough, that someday the right person would come along who could use the information to stop him. The meeting was interrupted by Deputy Santos, who knocked urgently on the office door. Her face was pale with worry as she entered, her hand resting unconsciously on her service weapon. Sheriff, we've got problems. Big ones. The state investigators you called, their supervisor received a complaint about you this morning. Someone alleged that you're conducting a harassment campaign against a prominent citizen based on fabricated evidence. Clay felt his chest tighten. What kind of complaint? The kind that comes with political pressure from Austin. Thomas Brennan's attorney filed a formal grievance claiming you're pursuing a personal vendetta, possibly motivated by mental instability following your mother's recent death. They're requesting that you be removed from the case pending a psychiatric evaluation. The attack was sophisticated and devastating, targeting Clay's credibility while simultaneously delaying the investigation. During a psychiatric evaluation process that could take weeks, Thomas would have time to intimidate witnesses, destroy evidence, and solidify his defense strategy. Emma would remain in danger. Other potential victims would stay silent, and the entire case would be derailed by procedural delays. There's more, Maria continued. 3 families that work for the Brennans received eviction notices this morning. Jennifer Brennan was told that her employment as a part-time bookkeeper has been terminated due to budget cuts. The message is pretty clear. Anyone who cooperates with your investigation will face economic retaliation. Clay thought about Thomas. Brennan's 48-hour ultimatum, realizing that the man hadn't been bluffing. He was using every tool at his disposal, legal challenges, political pressure, economic warfare, to destroy the investigation before it could gather momentum. The strategy was ruthless but effective, turning Clay's pursuit of justice into a threat to the community's economic stability. That evening, Clay sat in his study with Sarah's letter finally opened before him, her handwriting blurred by tears he hadn't shed in decades. She'd written with the desperate hope of a 19-year-old girl who believed that truth, once revealed, would somehow set things right. "Dear Clay, I know you'll blame yourself for what I'm about to do, but please don't. You were just a kid too, trying to build your own life, and I never gave you a real chance to help me. Uncle Raymond said that telling you would destroy our family and ruin your future, and I believed him because I was scared and alone and didn't know any better. I'm telling you now because maybe my truth can help you save other girls from what I went through. Raymond didn't just hurt me. He's hurt other children too, girls whose families depended on him for work or money. He's a predator who uses kindness and generosity as weapons, who makes people feel grateful and obligated before he shows them what that gratitude really costs. I know you're going to be a good sheriff someday because you have the kind of heart that wants to protect people. When you find children who've been hurt the way I was hurt, please don't let anyone convince you to look the other way. Please don't let them carry their secrets alone like I did. Please be the person I needed you to be, even though I was too afraid to give you the chance. I love you, and I forgive you for not knowing what you couldn't have known. Now I need you to forgive yourself and use what I'm telling you to help other children who don't have to die to find peace. Your sister Sarah." Clay folded the letter carefully, understanding finally that Sarah's suicide hadn't been an escape from unbearable pain. It had been a final act of love, a desperate attempt to leave him the tools he'd need to protect other children from the hell she'd endured. Her death had been a tragedy, but her truth was a gift that he'd been too guilt-ridden to accept until now. Margaret found him in his study at midnight, still sitting with Sarah's letter and Emma's torn doll on the desk before him. She read the letter without comment, then settled into the chair beside his desk with the quiet understanding of a woman who'd watched her husband struggle with ghosts for 28 years. "She was trying to save you from carrying her pain," Margaret said softly. "All these years, you've been punishing yourself for not reading a letter that was never meant to hurt you. I failed her, Margaret. I had chances to notice, to ask the right questions, to protect her from Raymond. Instead, I was so focused on my own future that I missed every sign she was in trouble. You were 18 years old, Clay, a boy who'd been raised in the same system that taught Sarah to keep quiet about abuse, the same system that's trying to silence Emma now. You can't change what happened to Sarah, but you can honor her memory by making sure Emma's story ends differently." The next morning brought news that Thomas Brennan's political connections reached further than Clay had imagined. The state attorney general's office called to inform him that his request for outside investigators was being reviewed by a special committee, a process that could take weeks while Thomas consolidated his position and intimidated witnesses into silence. Mayor Caldwell appeared at Clay's office before noon, his face flushed with anxiety and perspiration. The economic pressure was already taking its toll. 2 businesses had announced they were reconsidering expansion plans, and the bank president had expressed concerns about the community's stability, affecting loan approvals. "Clay, I'm asking you as a friend to reconsider this course of action. Thomas Brennan's attorney is talking about filing civil suits against the county, claiming that your investigation constitutes harassment and defamation. The insurance company says we might not be covered for lawsuits arising from rogue law enforcement actions. Jim, are you asking me to ignore child abuse to protect the county's insurance rates? I'm asking you to be realistic about what you can prove and what it's going to cost this community to pursue allegations that might not hold up in court. Thomas has been a pillar of this town for 30 years. His family built half the businesses that employ our residents. Are you really prepared to destroy all of that based on the testimony of a traumatized 7-year-old and some adults with decades-old grievances?" Clay looked at the torn doll on his desk, thinking about Emma's courage in speaking truth to power, about Sarah's final letter urging him to protect children who couldn't protect themselves. The economic and political forces arrayed against him were formidable, but they paled in comparison to the moral weight of a child's trust. "Jim, I took an oath to protect and serve this community. That includes protecting children from predators, even when those predators have money and influence. Especially then. After the mayor left, Clay called Dr. Hayes and asked her to arrange a meeting with the 2 adult survivors. If the state wasn't going to provide immediate help, he'd build his case with the resources he had: witness testimony, medical evidence, and the kind of patient police work that had served him well for 23 years. The investigation was far from over, but Clay understood now that it was about more than just Emma's safety or Thomas Brennan's crimes. It was about whether Cedar Ridge would continue to be a place where wealth and influence could buy immunity from justice, or whether it would finally confront the uncomfortable truths that had been festering in silence for generations. Sarah's diary sat locked in his desk drawer next to her letter, tangible proof that evil thrived in the shadows cast by willful blindness. Emma's torn doll served as a daily reminder that courage sometimes came in very small packages, and that protecting the innocent was worth any professional or personal cost. The battle lines were drawn, and Clay understood that the next phase of the investigation would test not just his resolve, but the community's willingness to face truths that challenged everything they'd chosen to believe about their most respected citizens. The Brennan family Bible had been in the church for 3 generations, its leather binding worn smooth by countless hands, and its pages marked with decades of highlighted passages about forgiveness, redemption, and the divine authority of family patriarchs. Thomas carried it to the pulpit the following Sunday morning, his presence commanding the attention of every congregant in First Baptist Church's sanctuary. "Friends, I come before you today with a heavy heart," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to public speaking. "Our community is under attack, not from outside forces, but from within, by those who would tear down good families based on lies and malicious gossip." The Brennan family Bible had been in the church for 3 generations, its leather binding worn smooth by countless hands, and its pages marked with decades of highlighted passages about forgiveness, redemption, and the divine authority of family patriarchs. Thomas carried it to the pulpit the following Sunday morning, his presence commanding the attention of every congregant in First Baptist Church's sanctuary. "Friends, I come before you today with a heavy heart," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to public speaking. "Our community is under attack, not from outside forces, but from within, by those who would tear down good families based on lies and malicious gossip." Clay sat in the back pew with Margaret, watching Thomas orchestrate a masterful performance. The man stood behind the pulpit like a wounded patriarch, his silver hair catching the morning light streaming through stained glass windows, his bearing dignified despite the alleged persecution he was enduring. Around them, congregation members nodded in sympathy, their faces reflecting the confusion and concern that comes from seeing a respected leader under assault. The Bible teaches us about false accusers, about those who would bear witness against the innocent for their own gain. Thomas continued, his fingers tracing the highlighted passages he'd carefully selected. "In Proverbs, we're warned about those who devise mischief and sow discord among brethren. In the book of Job, we see how the righteous are tested by those who would destroy their good name." Pastor Williams, a 40-year-old man whose salary was partially funded by Brennan donations, stood beside Thomas with obvious discomfort. Clay could see the internal struggle in the pastor's eyes, the tension between spiritual duty and financial reality, between protecting the vulnerable and maintaining the support of his most generous benefactor. "I've served this community faithfully for 30 years, Thomas said, his voice breaking with emotion that might have been genuine. "I've employed your sons and daughters, supported your businesses, contributed to every worthy cause this town has undertaken. Now I'm accused of unspeakable acts by those who would profit from my destruction. The congregation's response was predictable, murmurs of support, nodding heads, the collective rallying around a man they'd known and respected for decades. These were people who'd worked for Thomas, borrowed money from his bank, sold cattle through his network of buyers. Their livelihoods were intertwined with his success, their prosperity dependent on his continued good standing in the community. "I ask for your prayers during this difficult time," Thomas concluded, "and I ask for your patience while truth prevails over falsehood, while justice triumphs over persecution. God will vindicate the innocent as he always has, and those who bear false witness will face his judgment in due time." Clay felt Margaret's hand squeeze his arm as the congregation rose for the closing hymn. Around them, voices lifted in amazing grace, the familiar words taking on new meaning as Clay watched Thomas Brennan receive the embraces and support of people who genuinely believed he was the victim of a malicious campaign. After the service, Clay found himself isolated in the fellowship hall as congregation members gathered around Thomas to offer comfort and support. Former allies avoided his gaze. Longtime friends suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere, and the casual conversations that had always included him now stopped when he approached. Sheriff Hartwell, Mrs. Dorothy Ellis, the church organist, for 40 years, approached him with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. "I hope you know what you're doing, son. Thomas Brennan has been good to this church, good to this community. It would be a shame if misunderstandings caused permanent damage to a good man's reputation." The message was clear. The religious community that had supported Clay's campaigns and celebrated his achievements was now questioning his judgment and loyalty. Thomas had effectively weaponized faith against him, turning Christian concepts of forgiveness and redemption into shields against accountability for crimes that demanded justice rather than mercy. Deputy Santos was waiting in the church parking lot when Clay emerged, her face grim with news that would make the morning's religious manipulation seem mild by comparison. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. 3 more families received eviction notices this morning, and the bank president called to say that several loans tied to county employees might be reconsidered due to the current political instability." The economic warfare was escalating. Thomas wasn't content to attack Clay's credibility. He was systematically targeting anyone who might support the investigation, using his financial influence to create a climate of fear that would isolate potential witnesses and allies. "There's something else," Maria continued. "I got a call from my former captain in Houston. Someone's been asking questions about my service record, specifically about any incidents involving false allegations or professional misconduct. They're trying to build a case that I'm the real problem here, that I brought big city prejudices to a small town and influenced you to pursue innocent people." Clay felt his jaw tighten. The attack on Maria was particularly insidious. She was being targeted not just as his deputy, but as an outsider whose perspective threatened the community's carefully maintained illusions. Her experience with urban crime patterns made her dangerous to those who preferred to believe that certain kinds of evil simply didn't exist in places like Cedar Ridge. "Any luck with the state investigators?" Still tied up in committee review, Thomas's attorney filed a motion claiming that state involvement would constitute double jeopardy and violation of his civil rights. "It's all procedural nonsense, but it's buying him time to strengthen his position." That afternoon brought Clay's first significant ally from an unexpected source. Dr. Hayes called to report that 2 more adult survivors had contacted her after hearing about the investigation. Through the network of women who'd escaped Cedar Ridge, but maintained quiet connections to monitor the community's welfare. One is a social worker in Denver, now 43. She was abused by Thomas when she was 9 after her mother was hired as a housekeeper. The family left town when her father confronted Thomas and was subsequently fired and blacklisted from ranch work throughout the region. Clay took careful notes, understanding that each new testimony strengthened the case while simultaneously raising the stakes for everyone involved. Thomas wasn't just a single predator. He was the center of a systematic pattern of abuse that had been covered up and enabled for decades. The second woman is now a federal prosecutor in Seattle. She was 14 when Thomas assaulted her during a church youth trip that he chaperoned. When she told her parents, they were pressured by church leadership to keep quiet to avoid scandalizing the congregation. Her family moved away within 6 months. The irony was bitter. Thomas had used church activities as hunting grounds, exploiting the trust and authority that came with his position as a deacon to access and abuse children whose parents had been taught to respect his moral leadership. The same religious community that was now rallying to his defense had unknowingly provided him with victims and cover for his crimes. Clay spent the evening in his study, reviewing the growing case file and trying to develop a strategy that could overcome Thomas's political and economic advantages. The evidence was substantial. Medical documentation, witness testimony, patterns of behavior that stretched back decades. But evidence meant nothing without the political will to pursue it and the institutional support to see it through to conviction. Margaret found him there at 10 o'clock, surrounded by files and photographs that painted a disturbing picture of systematic predation and institutional cover-up. She settled into her chair with a cup of tea, her presence a comfort in the growing isolation that surrounded their household. "How bad is it?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Worse than I imagined. Thomas hasn't just been abusing children. He's been using the entire community as an accomplice, the church, the bank, the business network, even the political structure. Everything's been organized to protect him and silence his victims." Margaret sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And if you expose all of that, you don't just bring down one man. You reveal that an entire community has been built on willful blindness and moral compromise, which is why they're fighting so hard to discredit the investigation. It's not just about Thomas's guilt or innocence. It's about whether Cedar Ridge can face the truth about itself and still survive as a community." The phone rang at midnight, startling them both from the quiet contemplation that had settled over the study. Clay answered to find Dr. Hayes on the line, her voice tight with urgency and fear. "Clay, someone broke into my clinic tonight. They didn't take anything valuable, but Emma's medical files are missing, along with all the documentation I'd compiled on the other children. My computer was accessed, and backup files were deleted." Clay felt his chest tighten. The missing evidence represented months of careful documentation, the kind of systematic record-keeping that could make or break a prosecution case. Without Dr. Hayes's medical reports, the investigation would rely entirely on witness testimony that could be challenged and discredited in court. Any idea who might have had access? The alarm system was disabled professionally. No signs of forced entry, no damage to the building. Someone with technical knowledge and enough information about my security system to bypass it cleanly. Dr. Hayes paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Clay, I think we're dealing with more than just Thomas Brennan. This level of coordination suggests he has help from people with law enforcement or security backgrounds." The implications were chilling. Thomas's influence wasn't just economic and political. It extended into the technical and professional networks that could provide sophisticated support for covering up crimes. The missing files weren't just evidence destroyed. They were a message that no documentation was safe, no witness secure, no ally beyond reach of retaliation. Clay hung up the phone and stared at Emma's torn doll, sitting on his desk like a silent reminder of why the investigation mattered, despite the forces arrayed against it. Somewhere in Cedar Ridge, a 7-year-old girl was trying to sleep, while knowing that the man who'd hurt her was free to continue his predation, protected by a community that valued its reputation more than her safety. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, though she already knew her husband well enough to predict his answer. Now we find out how far Thomas Brennan's influence really extends, and whether there's anyone left in this town who's willing to choose justice over comfort. Clay locked the case files in his desk drawer, understanding that the investigation had moved beyond simple police work into something more like warfare. Emma trusted me to protect her. I'm not going to let her down the way I let Sarah down. The Brennan family Bible sat in Thomas's study that night, its highlighted passages serving as both justification and strategy guide for a man who'd learned to weaponize faith against accountability. But across town, in a courthouse office lit by a single desk lamp, Clay Hartwell prepared to wage his own kind of spiritual battle, one that would test whether truth could triumph over institutional power, whether justice could survive in a community built on comfortable lies. The torn doll watched over it all, a silent witness to the courage of children and the failures of adults, a reminder that some fights were worth losing everything to win. The photographs arrived in a manila envelope with no return address, delivered to Clay's office by a courier who'd been paid in cash and given no information about the sender. Inside were dozens of black and white surveillance images taken over several months, showing Thomas Brennan in situations that no church deacon should ever be photographed in. Clay spread the images across his desk with hands that trembled slightly, understanding immediately that someone with professional investigative skills had been watching Thomas for a very long time. The photographs showed Thomas with different children in various locations: his ranch, the church, a hunting cabin in the mountains, always isolated settings where no witnesses could observe his behavior. Most damning were the images taken through the cabin windows, showing Thomas in physical contact with children that clearly violated appropriate boundaries. While none of the photographs captured actual sexual assault, they documented a pattern of grooming behavior and inappropriate contact that corroborated the victim's testimonies perfectly. A typed note accompanied the photographs. These were taken over the past 18 months. The cabin is owned by Thomas Brennan under a shell company registered in Nevada. GPS coordinates are included for each location. More evidence available if you're willing to pursue justice regardless of political pressure. Clay studied the note carefully, recognizing the precision of language that suggested law enforcement or military training. Someone with significant resources and professional skills was operating as his anonymous ally, documenting Thomas's crimes while remaining hidden from the man's extensive network of supporters and enablers. Deputy Santos arrived within an hour of Clay's call, her face grim as she examined the photographs with the experienced eye of someone who'd worked sex crimes in Houston. These are professionally taken, Sheriff. Whoever shot them had high-end surveillance equipment and spent months establishing patterns. Any idea who might be behind it? Someone with a personal stake in seeing Thomas Brennan brought down. The level of commitment required for this kind of long-term surveillance suggests either a law enforcement officer working off the books or a private investigator hired by someone with deep pockets and deeper anger. The photographs provided crucial corroborating evidence, but they also raised unsettling questions about how long Thomas's crimes had been known and documented without intervention. Someone had been aware of his predatory behavior for months, had possessed evidence that could have protected other children, yet had waited until now to act. That afternoon brought another revelation that shifted Clay's understanding of the case's scope and complexity. Dr. Hayes called to report that one of the adult survivors had provided information about a network of similar cases across multiple states, suggesting that Thomas Brennan was connected to a broader pattern of organized child abuse among wealthy and influential families. She's a social worker now, specializes in trafficking cases. She says what happened to her in Cedar Ridge fits a pattern she's seen in other rural communities. Predators who use economic control and social influence to create hunting grounds among vulnerable families. Clay felt his chest tighten. If Thomas was part of a larger network, the investigation could expand far beyond Cedar Ridge, potentially involving federal agencies and resources that might overwhelm local law enforcement. But it also suggested that more children were at risk, that the stakes extended beyond Emma's individual case to a systematic pattern of exploitation. "There's something else," Dr. Hayes continued. "She mentioned that Thomas used to travel frequently when she was being abused, taking trips to other states for what he called business meetings. She remembers him bringing back photographs and gifts, talking about special friends he'd met in other towns. The implications were chilling. Thomas might have been part of a network of predators who shared information, resources, and possibly victims across state lines. The hunting cabin where he'd been photographed could be part of a larger infrastructure designed to isolate and abuse children away from potential witnesses or interference." Clay's investigation received an unexpected boost that evening when Margaret answered a knock at their front door to find a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Detective Linda Morrison from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. She was tall and athletic, with the kind of presence that came from years of working dangerous cases, and she carried a briefcase that suggested official business. "Sheriff Hartwell, I've been following your investigation into Thomas Brennan. I believe our cases may be connected." They settled in Clay's study, where Detective Morrison opened her briefcase to reveal files that painted a disturbing picture of interstate criminal activity. She'd been investigating a network of wealthy men who used hunting lodges and private retreats to facilitate child abuse, and Thomas Brennan's name had appeared in financial records and travel documentation connected to several of the suspect properties. "We've been tracking a group of businessmen and politicians who've been using legitimate hunting and fishing trips as cover for systematic child abuse. They recruit victims from economically dependent families in rural communities, use remote properties to avoid detection, and rely on their social status to deflect suspicion." Detective Morrison spread out photographs and financial records that showed Thomas's involvement with properties in Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming. Bank records documented payments to shell companies that owned remote cabins. Travel records showed trips that coincided with reported abuse cases and communication. Intercepts revealed coded conversations about hunting parties and special guests. Your Emma Brennan case fits the pattern perfectly. A vulnerable child from a financially dependent family, an abuser with community standing and economic power, systematic grooming that escalates to serious assault. We've seen this same structure in 6 different states. Clay studied the evidence with growing horror, understanding that Emma's abuse was part of something much larger and more organized than he'd imagined. Thomas wasn't just a local predator taking advantage of his position. He was a participant in a network that had been operating for years, possibly decades, with sophisticated methods for avoiding detection and prosecution. "Why are you coming forward now?" Clay asked. "Because our federal investigation has been stalled by political pressure and jurisdictional complications. We need local law enforcement officers willing to pursue these cases despite the obstacles, and your reputation for integrity preceded your current situation." Detective Morrison closed her files carefully. "Also, because one of our victims, specifically, mentioned Thomas Brennan by name, describing abuse that occurred at a Colorado cabin that matches the location in your surveillance photographs. The federal connection provided Clay with resources and authority he'd been lacking, but it also meant that the investigation would attract even more powerful opposition. If Thomas was part of an interstate network, his allies would include people with federal connections, political influence that extended far beyond Cedar Ridge, and resources that could destroy local law enforcement careers without hesitation. Margaret served coffee while Clay and Detective Morrison planned their strategy, her presence a calming influence in discussions that dealt with the darkest aspects of human nature. She'd been married to a law enforcement officer long enough to understand that some cases demanded everything a person could give, regardless of personal cost. "What kind of support can you provide?" Clay asked. "Technical resources, forensic analysis of the photographs and financial records, witness protection for anyone willing to testify, and federal charges that can't be derailed by local political impressure." Detective Morrison stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "But I need you to understand what you're taking on. This network has been operating for years because they have protection at every level, local, state, and federal. Pursuing this case will make you enemies in places you've never imagined." Clay looked at Emma's torn doll, sitting on his desk, like a silent reminder of why the investigation mattered, regardless of political consequences. "Detective, I've got a 7-year-old girl who trusted me to protect her from a monster. I've got a dead sister who tried to warn me about predators 28 years too late. I've got a community that's been built on looking the other way while children suffer. I don't care who I make enemies with." The meeting was interrupted by a phone call that changed everything. Deputy Santos called to report that Emma had been taken from her foster home by armed men claiming to be federal agents, though no federal agencies had any record of such an operation. The foster parents had been shown official-looking identification and warrants that appeared legitimate, but subsequent verification revealed that both were sophisticated forgeries. "They took her 40 minutes ago," Maria reported, her voice tight with urgency. "The foster parents tried to call the phone number on the warrant to verify, but it was disconnected. I've contacted every federal agency in the region, and none of them have any operations involving Emma Brennan." Clay felt his world narrow to a single point of desperate focus. Emma hadn't just been kidnapped. She'd been taken by people with the resources and technical skills to create convincing federal credentials, people who understood law enforcement procedures well enough to execute a sophisticated deception operation. Detective Morrison was already on her phone, activating federal resources for what had suddenly become a kidnapping case with interstate implications. "I'm calling in everything we've got. FBI Child Abduction Response Team, Marshal Service, State Police in 4 states. If Thomas Brennan's network took that child, they've just committed a federal crime that will bring down the full weight of federal law enforcement." But Clay understood that federal resources would take time to organize, and Emma didn't have time. Somewhere in the network of remote properties and safe houses that Thomas had developed over decades of predatory behavior, a 7-year-old girl was being held by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit serious crimes to protect their operations. The torn doll sat abandoned on the foster family's kitchen table, where Emma had been forced to leave it behind, its button eyes reflecting the afternoon light streaming through windows that had failed to protect the child who'd trusted adults to keep her safe from monsters. Clay picked up his service weapon and checked his ammunition, understanding that the investigation had moved beyond evidence gathering into something more immediate and dangerous. Emma's kidnapping wasn't just a crime. It was a declaration of war by people who believed they were above the law, beyond accountability, protected by networks of influence and intimidation that had kept them safe for decades. Detective Morrison coordinated with federal agencies while Clay studied maps of Thomas Brennan's properties, cross-referencing them with the surveillance photographs and financial records that revealed the scope of his network. The hunting cabin in the mountains was the most likely location, remote enough to avoid detection, equipped with the kind of security and isolation that would make rescue attempts difficult and dangerous. "Sheriff," Margaret said quietly, her hand resting on his shoulder as he prepared to leave. "Bring that little girl home safely, whatever it costs, whatever it takes. Bring her home." Clay nodded, understanding that the next few hours would determine not just Emma's fate, but whether justice could triumph over the kind of organized evil that had been festering in Cedar Ridge's shadows for generations. The photographs in his evidence file showed a network of predators who had operated with impunity for years, protected by wealth and influence and the willful blindness of communities that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But Emma had trusted him with her truth, had clutched her torn doll and whispered her secrets to a sheriff who'd promised to keep her safe. Now, as federal agents mobilized and state police prepared to converge on remote mountain locations, Clay understood that some promises were worth dying to keep. The hidden recording device was no larger than a button, professionally installed behind a family photograph in Thomas Brennan's private study, and connected to a transmission system that had been broadcasting conversations to a remote location for over 6 months. Clay discovered it purely by accident when he and Detective Morrison searched Thomas's house under the emergency warrant issued after Emma's kidnapping. Dr. Rebecca Hayes met them at the Brennan Ranch with a key she'd kept hidden for 15 years, and a confession that would transform everything Clay thought he understood about the case. She led them through the main house with the familiarity of someone who'd spent considerable time there, her medical bag replaced by a small electronic device that could detect surveillance equipment. "I've been recording Thomas for 18 months, she said quietly, as they stood in his study, surrounded by the symbols of respectability, law books, religious texts, photographs of community events where Thomas appeared as a pillar of moral authority, every confession, every plan, every conversation where he revealed the scope of his crimes." Clay stared at the woman he'd known for over a decade, understanding that Dr. Rebecca Hayes was not who she'd appeared to be. "Rebecca, what aren't you telling me?" She reached into her medical bag and withdrew a thick folder filled with transcripts, photographs and official documents that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning decades. "My name isn't Rebecca Hayes. It's Rebecca Morrison. Detective Linda Morrison is my sister. I'm a federal agent, Sheriff, and I've been undercover in Cedar Ridge for 15 years, documenting Thomas Brennan's crimes and the network that protects him." The revelation hit Clay like physical blow. The doctor who'd examined Emma, who'd provided medical evidence for the case, who'd been his primary ally in pursuing justice. She was a federal agent whose entire identity in Cedar Ridge was a carefully constructed lie designed to infiltrate Thomas's network. 15 years. Clay's voice was hoarse with disbelief. "You've been watching him abuse children for 15 years without stopping him?" "I've been building a case against an interstate network of predators that includes judges, prosecutors, politicians, and law enforcement officers in 12 states. Thomas Brennan is just one node in a system that's been operating for over 30 years. Rebecca's voice carried the weight of someone who'd carried unbearable secrets for too long. "We needed evidence that would bring down the entire network. Not just one man who could be replaced by another predator in the same position." She activated the recording device, and Thomas Brennan's voice filled the room with words that would destroy his defense and reveal the true scope of his crimes. "The key is selecting children from families that depend on us economically. They can't report abuse without destroying their own survival. Emma was perfect, orphaned, dependent, isolated from potential advocates. Her mother works for us, lives in our housing, has no resources to fight back." The recording continued with Thomas discussing other victims, other locations, other members of the network who provided children or protected abusers. He talked about judges who dismissed cases, prosecutors who declined to file charges, police officers who lost evidence or intimidated witnesses. The conspiracy was vast, sophisticated, and protected by corruption that reached every level of the justice system. "The beauty of the system is that we've made ourselves indispensable to these communities. They won't destroy us because it would destroy themselves. The churches need our donations, the businesses need our investments, the politicians need our support. We've created a web of dependency that makes us untouchable." Clay listened with growing horror as Thomas detailed methods for grooming victims, techniques for avoiding detection, and strategies for discrediting anyone who threatened to expose the network. The man wasn't just a predator, he was a systematic, architect of child abuse who'd studied how to exploit economic, social, and political systems to create perfect hunting grounds. Sarah Hartwell was a mistake. She was too old, too independent, too likely to find help outside the family system. When she started talking about telling her brother, we had to eliminate the threat, making it look like suicide was Raymond's idea, but I approved the decision. The words stopped Clay's breath. His sister hadn't committed suicide. She'd been murdered by the same network that was now targeting Emma. Raymond hadn't just been Sarah's abuser. He'd been Thomas's partner in a criminal enterprise that had killed her to protect their operations. Sarah was murdered, Clay said, his voice barely a whisper. Thomas ordered her death when she threatened to expose Raymond's abuse and the broader network behind it. They staged the suicide carefully, made it look like the inevitable result of depression and trauma. But Sarah had already contacted federal authorities through a school counselor. That's how we first learned about the Cedar Ridge connection. Rebecca pulled out another folder, this one containing Sarah's actual communications with federal agents, her descriptions of the network she'd discovered, her fear that speaking out would result in her death. She'd been braver than Clay had ever imagined, smart enough to understand that her abuse was part of something larger, courageous enough to try to stop it despite the risks. She was going to be our witness, Rebecca continued. A 19-year-old girl who was willing to testify against powerful men because she wanted to protect other children. When she was murdered, we lost our key witness and had to start over with a long-term infiltration strategy. Clay thought about the letter Sarah had written to him, her final words urging him to protect children who couldn't protect themselves. She died trying to expose the network that was now threatening Emma, had sacrificed her life in an attempt to save future victims from the hell she'd endured. "Where is Emma now?" Clay asked, understanding that the federal operation was far more complex than he'd realized. Safe. The fake kidnapping was necessary to get her away from local threats while we prepared to move against the entire network. She's with my sister in a secure federal facility, protected by agents who understand the scope of what we're dealing with. The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by anger at the deception that had put everyone through hell. You let me think she'd been kidnapped. You let me believe she was in danger. She was in danger, Sheriff. Thomas's network includes people with federal law enforcement credentials, people who could have taken her legitimately if they'd realized how much evidence we'd collected. The fake kidnapping gave us the legal justification to move Emma to safety, while maintaining the appearance that the local investigation was still developing. Detective Linda Morrison entered the study as if summoned by their conversation. Her presence now explained as part of a federal operation that had been years in development. Sheriff, we're ready to execute warrants across 4 states simultaneously. This network is about to be destroyed, but we need your help with the local arrests. Clay looked around Thomas's study, understanding that he'd been fighting a battle much larger than he'd realized. The photographs, the recordings, the evidence that had seemed to appear from anonymous sources, it had all been part of a federal operation designed to build an unbreakable case against predators who'd believed they were protected by wealth, influence, and systematic corruption. What about Thomas? Clay asked, in custody as of an hour ago, along with 12 other network members. The recordings you just heard are being presented to federal prosecutors right now, along with evidence from victims across multiple states who are finally willing to testify because they know the entire network is being destroyed simultaneously. Rebecca handed Clay a secure phone. Emma wants to talk to you. She's been worried about her torn doll. Apparently, you promised to keep it safe for her. Clay took the phone with hands that trembled slightly, hearing Emma's voice for the first time since her rescue. "Sheriff Clay, the nice lady agent said you kept my dolly safe. I was scared they would hurt her when they took me away from the bad men. Your doll is right here with me, sweetheart. She's been keeping me company while I made sure the bad men couldn't hurt you anymore. Are they really gone?" All of them? The man who said he was my uncle and the other scary men who came to the cabin? They're all gone, Emma. You don't have to be afraid anymore. And when you come home, your doll will be waiting for you, and we'll make sure you're safe forever." Clay ended the call and looked at the torn doll sitting on Thomas's desk, understanding that it had been a witness to more than just one child's abuse. It had been present during the investigation that brought down a network of predators who'd operated with impunity for decades. The federal operation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Arrests were made simultaneously in 12 states, targeting a network that included prominent businessmen, politicians, judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officers who'd been protecting and enabling systematic child abuse for over 30 years. Thomas Brennan's empire collapsed within 48 hours. As financial records revealed money laundering, property seizures uncovered evidence of decades of crimes, and recorded conversations provided prosecutors with everything they needed to secure convictions that would put the network's leaders in federal prison for the rest of their lives. Cedar Ridge faced a reckoning that forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about the foundations of their prosperity and the price of their willful blindness. The economic disruption was significant but temporary. Federal authorities worked with legitimate businesses to ensure that jobs and essential services continued, while corrupt enterprises were dissolved and their assets redistributed to victim or compensation funds. Clay stood in his office 3 days after the arrests, looking out at a town that was beginning to understand the difference between genuine respectability and the facade that had hidden decades of unspeakable crimes. Emma's torn doll sat on his desk beside Sarah's letter, two symbols of courage that had ultimately helped bring justice to children who'd suffered in silence for too long. The truth had been more complex than he'd imagined, but the result was exactly what Sarah had hoped for in her final letter: predators brought to justice, children protected from future harm, and a community forced to choose between comfortable lies and the hard work of genuine healing. Rebecca Hayes, or whoever she really was, had been right about one thing: some fights required decades of patience and sacrifice to win. But Emma's courage in speaking truth to power, combined with Sarah's final act of love and a federal agent's 15-year commitment to justice, had finally brought light to shadows that had hidden evil for far too long. Clay's father's service weapon hadn't been fired in anger for over 30 years, but it felt familiar in his hands as he prepared for what federal agents were calling the most complex child predator takedown in Bureau history. The vintage Colt .45 had belonged to Sheriff William Hartwell, a man who'd served Cedar Ridge when law enforcement meant riding alone into dangerous situations with nothing but courage and a commitment to protecting the innocent. "Your father would be proud," Margaret said quietly, as Clay checked the weapon's action in their bedroom, surrounded by tactical gear that federal agents had provided for the operation. He always said that being a lawman meant standing between good people and those who would hurt them, regardless of the personal cost. Clay holstered the weapon carefully, understanding that the next 12 hours would determine whether a network of predators who'd operated with impunity for decades would finally face justice, or whether their connections and resources would allow them to escape accountability once again. The federal task force had identified 18 locations across 4 states where simultaneous raids would capture network members and rescue victims, but the coordination required was unprecedented, and the margin for error was nearly zero. Detective Linda Morrison briefed the assembled federal agents and local law enforcement officers in a command post established at the Cedar Ridge courthouse. Maps covered the walls, showing target locations. Surveillance photographs documented suspect movements, and communication equipment connected the operation to federal resources across the western United States. "We have one chance to get this." "Right," Morrison announced to the room full of hardened law enforcement veterans. This network has survived for 30 years because they've always been one step ahead of investigations, always had warning when raids were coming, always had the political connections necessary to derail prosecutions. Tonight, we're hitting all of them simultaneously without warning, with evidence that can't be suppressed or discredited. Clay studied the tactical plan for the Brennan Ranch operation, understanding that his role would be critical because of his familiarity with the property and his established relationship with local resources. The ranch wasn't just Thomas's home. It was a fortress designed to withstand exactly the kind of coordinated law enforcement assault they were planning. The ranch has multiple buildings, underground bunkers that were supposedly built for tornado protection and security systems that rival military installations, Clay explained to the federal tactical team. Thomas spent decades preparing for the possibility that his crimes would eventually catch up with him, and that property is designed to give him every possible advantage in a siege situation. The team leader, a 20-year FBI veteran named Agent Sarah Chen, studied the property schematics with professional interest. How many potential hostages might be on the property? Unknown. The ranch employs between 20 and 30 people, depending on the season, plus family members who live in various buildings on the property. If Thomas realizes he's trapped, he might try to use innocent people as shields to negotiate his escape. Agent Chen nodded grimly. That's consistent with his psychological profile. He's a narcissist who believes he's above the law, but he's also a planner who would have prepared contingencies for exactly this situation. We have to assume he's armed, dangerous, and willing to hurt innocent people to avoid accountability for his crimes. The operation faced additional complications because some network members had law enforcement connections that could provide them with advance warning of federal activities. The task force had been assembled using only agents whose backgrounds had been thoroughly vetted, but the possibility remained that someone with network connections might alert targets before the raids could be executed. We're operating under complete communication blackout until all raids are simultaneous, Morrison explained. No cell phones, no radio contact with outside agencies, no digital communications that could be intercepted or monitored. Once we begin moving toward targets, we're committed regardless of what intelligence might suggest we should abort. Clay thought about Emma, safe in federal protection, but undoubtedly frightened and confused by events she couldn't fully understand. The little girl who'd clutched her torn doll and whispered terrible secrets had triggered an operation that would determine the fate of hundreds of victims and dozens of predators, but she had no way of knowing whether the adults she'd trusted would be able to deliver the justice they'd promised. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, whose real identity was still classified even among the federal agents, provided final intelligence about Thomas's likely behavior patterns and the security measures built into his property. Her 15 years of undercover work had given her insights that no external surveillance could have provided. Thomas has always believed that his wealth and connections make him untouchable, but he's also paranoid about maintaining operational security. The ranch has escape routes that lead to airstrips where private aircraft can provide rapid evacuation to countries without extradition treaties. If he realizes the scope of tonight's operation, he'll try to run rather than fight, unless he has hostages, Agent Chen observed. Predators like Thomas view other people as tools to be used for their own purposes. If he can't escape, he might try to negotiate using innocent lives as leverage. The psychological assessment was sobering. Thomas Brennan wasn't just a criminal facing justice, he was a narcissistic predator who'd spent decades believing that rules didn't apply to him, that his wealth and influence placed him above the law. Cornered animals were dangerous, but cornered predators with resources and desperation were potentially catastrophic. Clay spent the afternoon in tactical preparation, reviewing property maps and coordinating with local resources that couldn't be compromised by network connections. Deputy Maria Santos would coordinate with state police to establish perimeters around all Brennan properties, while volunteer firefighters would provide medical support for potential casualties. "Sheriff," Maria said quietly as they reviewed the operational timeline, "I need you to know that whatever happens tonight, you've already won the important battle. Emma is safe, the network is exposed, and the truth is finally coming out. Don't risk your life trying to personally arrest Thomas Brennan. Let the federal agents handle the dangerous work." But Clay understood that his presence during the arrests was symbolically important, not just for the case, but for Cedar Ridge's healing process. The community needed to see that local law enforcement had played a crucial role in bringing predators to justice, that their sheriff had chosen to protect children even when it meant challenging the most powerful family in town. Margaret found him in his study that evening, surrounded by tactical gear and case files that represented months of investigation and decades of systematic abuse. She sat in her familiar chair with the cross-stitch that had been her constant companion throughout their marriage, her presence a calming influence despite the gravity of the approaching operation. "I've been thinking about Sarah," she said quietly, her needle moving in the steady rhythm that had helped her process 27 years of being married to a law enforcement officer. About how proud she'd be to know that her death led to saving all these other children. She'd want you to come home safely, Clay. She'd want you to see Emma grow up free from the monsters that destroyed her own childhood. Clay looked at his father's service weapon, understanding that the next 12 hours would test everything he'd learned about courage, justice, and the price of protecting the innocent. William Hartwell had faced dangerous men with nothing but a badge and a commitment to doing what was right. Tonight, his son would face predators who'd hidden behind wealth and influence for decades, armed with evidence that would finally bring them to justice. "Margaret, if something happens to me tonight, nothing's going to happen to you," she interrupted firmly. "You're going to arrest the men who hurt Sarah and Emma and all those other children. You're going to come home safely, and we're going to watch that little girl grow up in a world where predators can't hide behind respectability." The secure phone buzzed with a message from Agent Chen. "All teams in position. Operation commences at 0300 hours. Radio silence until all clear signal." Clay checked his gear one final time, understanding that the next few hours would determine whether decades of systematic child abuse would finally be brought to an end. Emma's torn doll sat on his desk beside Sarah's letter, two symbols of courage that had motivated his pursuit of justice despite overwhelming odds. The doll's button eyes reflected the lamplight as Clay prepared to leave, its presence a reminder that some fights were worth any risk, any sacrifice, any personal cost. The federal task force would handle the tactical complexity of the operation, but Clay carried something that tactical training couldn't provide: the moral authority of a man who'd witnessed evil firsthand and refused to compromise with it. Thomas Brennan and his network had depended on the silence of victims and the complicity of communities that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Tonight, that silence would end forever, and the children who'd suffered in darkness would finally see justice delivered by adults who understood that protecting the innocent was the most sacred duty of civilized society. Clay's father had taught him that being a lawman meant standing between good people and those who would hurt them. Tonight, Sheriff Clay Hartwell would honor that teaching by ending a nightmare that had lasted far too long. Emma's drawing had been created during her stay in federal protection, a crayon masterpiece that showed a small girl holding hands with a tall man in a sheriff's hat, both of them standing in front of a house with bright yellow sunshine and a rainbow arcing across a blue sky. She'd given it to Agent Chen with instructions that it should be delivered to Sheriff Clay, who promised to keep me safe, and now it was tucked into Clay's tactical vest as he approached the Brennan ranch in the pre-dawn darkness. The federal Assault began at precisely 3 a.m. across 18 locations in 4 states, coordinated with military precision and supported by overwhelming resources that Thomas Brennan's network had never faced before. But the Brennan Ranch operation encountered immediate complications when surveillance teams reported unusual activity. Armed guards patrolling the property, vehicles positioned for rapid evacuation, and lights burning in buildings that should have been empty at that hour. Target is aware of our presence, Agent Chen reported through encrypted communications. Security posture suggests they've been preparing for exactly this kind of operation. We're dealing with a fortified position defended by people who know we're coming. Clay crouched behind a stone fence that marked the ranch's outer boundary, studying the main house through night vision scopes that revealed defensive positions and movement patterns, suggesting professional security rather than ranch hands pressed into guard duty. Thomas hadn't just prepared for this moment. He'd hired people with military or law enforcement backgrounds to help him resist arrest. Sheriff, Agent Chen's voice came through his earpiece. We've identified at least 12 armed defenders. A plus movement in the underground bunker system that could indicate hostages. This is going to be more complex than we planned. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly when the first federal agents moved toward the main house and were met with automatic weapons fire that indicated serious resistance rather than token defiance. Thomas Brennan wasn't surrendering quietly. He was fighting a war against law enforcement officers who represented 30 years of avoided accountability. Clay watched from his position as federal agents established a perimeter around the ranch complex, their professional movements contrasting sharply with the desperate defensive fire coming from the buildings. This wasn't a simple arrest operation anymore. It had become a siege against a fortified position, defended by people who understood that capture meant life in federal prison. We've got hostages confirmed, came the report from Agent Chen. Thermal imaging shows at least 6 individuals in the underground bunker, including what appears to be children. Thomas is using innocent people as human shields to prevent us from using overwhelming force. The hostage situation changed everything. Federal agents couldn't use the kind of aggressive tactics that would normally end a standoff quickly because innocent lives were at stake. Thomas had calculated correctly that law enforcement officers would sacrifice tactical advantages to protect potential victims, giving him time to negotiate or find escape routes. Clay's radio crackled with updates from other operations across the country. Most raids were proceeding smoothly, with suspects taken into custody without significant resistance, but 3 locations had become active battlegrounds where network members were fighting desperately to avoid arrest. The coordination that had been the operation's strength was becoming a weakness as resources were stretched across multiple crisis situations. Sheriff Hartwell, Agent Chen's voice carried the strain of commanding a complex operation under fire. We need someone who knows this property intimately. Can you identify potential escape routes or weak points in their defensive position? Clay studied the ranch layout through his scope, remembering visits he'd made over the years for legitimate law enforcement business. Thomas had always been proud of his property improvements, eager to show off security features that he'd claimed were necessary to protect his family and business interests from potential threats. There's a maintenance tunnel that connects the main house to the bunker system, Clay reported. Thomas showed it to me during a security consultation 5 years ago. It was designed to allow movement between buildings without exposure to outside observation. If your people can access it, they might be able to approach the hostages without being detected by the defenders. The tactical team spent precious minutes planning an approach that would use Clay's local knowledge to bypass Thomas's defensive preparations. But as they moved into position, new intelligence revealed that the situation was even more complex than they'd realized. Thermal imaging suggested that some of the people in the bunkers weren't hostages, but additional network members who'd gathered at the ranch for a pre-planned meeting. We're dealing with at least 20 suspects concentrated in one location, Agent Chen reported. This isn't just Thomas Brennan we're arresting. This is a significant portion of the entire network that decided to make their stand together rather than try to escape individually. Clay felt his chest tighten as he understood the full implications. The federal operation hadn't just stumbled onto Thomas at his ranch. They'd interrupted a meeting of network leadership that could have included some of the most dangerous predators in the entire conspiracy. The intelligence value was enormous, but so were the risks of a prolonged siege involving dozens of desperate criminals. The first real breakthrough came when Clay spotted movement near the ranch's communications building, where someone was attempting to establish contact with outside allies who might provide assistance or evacuation resources. Using his intimate knowledge of the property, he was able to guide federal snipers to positions where they could neutralize the communications equipment without risking civilian casualties. "Communications down," came the report. "Target location is now isolated from outside support." But Thomas responded to the isolation by escalating his threats against the hostages. A radio transmission on an emergency frequency made his position clear. "I have 6 people in secure locations throughout the property. Any attempt to storm our positions will result in their immediate execution. I want helicopters for evacuation and guarantees of safe passage to international waters." Agent Chen's response was professional but firm. "Mr. Brennan, you're surrounded by federal agents with overwhelming resources. Release the hostages and surrender peacefully, and we can discuss the terms of your cooperation with federal prosecutors." Clay listened to the exchange, understanding that negotiation was essentially theater. Both sides knew that Thomas would never surrender voluntarily, and federal agents couldn't allow him to escape with evidence that could compromise ongoing investigations in other jurisdictions. The siege would continue until one side or the other found a decisive advantage. The game changer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, monitoring communications from the federal command post, recognized voices on Thomas's radio transmissions as men she'd recorded during her undercover operation. She provided real-time intelligence about their psychology, their relationships, and their likely behavior patterns under stress. Thomas is losing control of the situation because he's used to being the dominant figure in any group, but some of the men with him have their own agendas and their own escape plans, she reported. "If you can create enough pressure, they'll turn on each other rather than maintain unity against you." Clay volunteered for the most dangerous part of the operation that followed, using his knowledge of Thomas's personality and his established relationship with the man to attempt direct communication that might divide the defenders and create opportunities for tactical resolution. It meant exposing himself to sniper fire and putting his life at risk, but it also meant possibly ending the siege before innocent hostages were killed. Moving to within shouting distance of the main house, Clay called out to the man he'd known for decades as a respected community leader, but now understood as a predator who'd built his entire life around exploiting vulnerable children. "Thomas, this is Clay Hartwell. I know you can hear me. Let's talk about how this ends." The response came in the form of automatic weapons fire that forced Clay to dive behind a cattle trough, but it also revealed defensive positions that federal snipers could target. The siege was entering its final phase, with both sides understanding that dawn would bring either resolution or escalation that could result in multiple casualties. Clay pressed himself against the cold metal of the trough, Emma's drawing crackling against his vest as he prepared for the confrontation that would determine whether decades of systematic child abuse would finally end in justice, or whether Thomas Brennan would find one more way to escape accountability for his crimes. The torn doll that had started this entire investigation sat on his desk back in town, its button eyes bearing witness to the courage of a 7-year-old girl who trusted a sheriff to protect her from monsters. Now, in the darkness before dawn, that sheriff prepared to honor her trust by finishing what her bravery had started. Clay's sheriff's badge had been pinned to his chest for 23 years through domestic disputes and cattle-rustling cases, through budget meetings and community festivals, through all the mundane responsibilities that made small-town law enforcement more about service than heroism. Now, as dawn approached over the Brennan Ranch, that tarnished piece of metal represented everything he'd sworn to protect: the innocent, the vulnerable, the children who depended on adults to stand between them and evil. "Thomas," Clay called, out from behind the cattle trough, his voice carrying across the ranch yard with the authority of a man who'd finally found his moment of absolute moral clarity. "This ends now. No more children get hurt. No more families get destroyed. No more hiding behind respectability while you prey on the vulnerable." The response came not in gunfire, but in Thomas's voice, strained with desperation, but still carrying the arrogance that had protected him for decades. "Clay, you don't understand what you're dealing with. This network includes judges, prosecutors, politicians at the highest levels. Even if you arrest me, even if you think you've won, we have the resources to destroy your case and your career. Walk away now, and we can discuss terms." Clay felt something settle in his chest, a calmness that came from understanding that some choices transcended personal consequences. "Thomas, I've got a 7-year-old girl's drawing in my vest pocket showing her and me standing together in the sunshine. I've got my dead sister's letter in my desk drawer asking me to protect children, the way I couldn't protect her. I've got my father's service weapon on my hip, carried by a man who understood that being a lawman means standing between good people and those who would hurt them. I'm not walking away." The federal tactical team used Clay's communication with Thomas as cover for positioning that would end the siege decisively. Agent Chen coordinated simultaneous breaches of 3 buildings while snipers neutralized external defenders, but the operation's success depended on rescuing hostages before Thomas could carry out his threats. Clay moved toward the main house, using his knowledge of the property to avoid defensive positions, understanding that his personal confrontation with Thomas might be the key to preventing civilian casualties. The man who'd once attended Clay's swearing-in ceremony and contributed to his campaign fund was now a desperate predator whose decades of crimes were finally catching up with him. The bunker entrance was exactly where Clay remembered it from. His security consultation years earlier, hidden beneath a decorative gazebo that Thomas had shown off as an example of his attention to aesthetic details. Clay descended concrete steps into an underground complex that revealed the true scope of Thomas's preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. The bunker was equipped like a military command center, with communications equipment, weapons, storage, and living quarters designed to support an extended siege. But it also contained something that made Clay's stomach clench: holding cells that had clearly been designed to imprison children, soundproofed rooms equipped with recording equipment, and a level of systematic infrastructure for abuse that exceeded anything the federal investigation had uncovered. Clay found Thomas in the central command room, surrounded by 3 other men who'd been part of the network's leadership structure. They were armed and desperate, but they were also arguing among themselves about escape strategies and blame assignments that revealed the fractures Dr. Hayes had predicted would develop under pressure. "Sheriff Hartwell," Thomas said with forced calm, his hand resting on a pistol, while his eyes darted between the monitors showing federal positions surrounding his property. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable about this situation. We can still find a solution that protects everyone's interests." "Where are the hostages, Thomas?" "Safe, as long as certain guarantees are provided. You know I'm not a violent man, Clay. I've never hurt anyone who didn't—" He stopped himself, understanding that his usual justifications wouldn't work with someone who'd seen the medical evidence of his crimes. Clay studied the men with Thomas, recognizing two of them from community functions where they'd appeared as respectable businessmen supporting local charities and civic organizations. The third was a stranger, but his bearing suggested law enforcement or military background, possibly one of the corrupt officials who'd provided network protection for decades. Thomas, it's over. The entire network is being arrested simultaneously. Across 4 states, your communications are down, your escape routes are blocked, and federal agents have evidence that will put you in prison for the rest of your life. The only thing left to decide is whether innocent people die before you face justice. The desperation in Thomas's eyes shifted to something harder, more dangerous. Clay recognized the expression of a narcissist who'd never been held accountable for his actions, who couldn't accept that his wealth and influence had finally failed to protect him from consequences. You think you've won something, Clay? You think arresting me changes anything? I've been doing this for 30 years because the system allows it, encourages it, protects it. There will always be men like me, and there will always be children, like Emma, and there will always be communities like Cedar Ridge that would rather look the other way than face uncomfortable truths. Clay felt his hand move to his father's service weapon, understanding that Thomas was goading him toward violence that would compromise the entire operation. Maybe you're right about the system, Thomas. Maybe there will always be predators who try to exploit children. But today, right now, this one predator faces justice. Emma is safe, your network is destroyed, and the children you've hurt will finally see their abuser held accountable. The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of explosions above as federal agents breached the bunker's secondary entrances. Thomas's allies panicked, abandoning their defensive positions to flee toward escape routes that no longer existed. In the confusion, Clay saw his opportunity to end the standoff without bloodshed. It's over, Thomas. Surrender now, and the hostages live. Continue this, and you'll be remembered as a child killer as well as a child abuser. Thomas raised his weapon toward Clay, his face twisted with 30 years of rage at a world that had finally refused to enable his crimes. But the shot that ended the siege came from Agent Chen, who'd used the chaos to position herself for a clean shot that neutralized the threat without risking civilian casualties. The hostages, 3 ranch employees and 2 children from families that worked for the network, were found alive and unharmed in secured rooms throughout the bunker complex. The children showed signs of recent trauma that confirmed they'd been intended as victims rather than shields, saved only by the timing of the federal operation. Thomas Brennan died in the underground bunker he'd built to protect himself from accountability, surrounded by the evidence of decades of systematic child abuse and betrayed by allies who'd chosen self-preservation over loyalty. His network collapsed within hours, as arrests across multiple states netted over 40 suspects and rescued dozens of victims who'd been trapped in cycles of exploitation and silence. Clay emerged from the bunker as the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, carrying Thomas's confession recordings and the evidence that would ensure convictions for everyone involved in the network. Emma's drawing was still pressed against his vest, its crayon sunshine a reminder that some battles were worth any cost, any sacrifice, any personal risk. Agent Chen approached him with the respect due to a law enforcement officer who'd risked everything to protect the innocent. Sheriff, it's finished. The network is destroyed. The victims are safe and justice will be served. Your sister would be proud of what you accomplished here. Clay looked across the ranch property where he'd spent the night fighting for Emma's future and Sarah's memory, understanding that the real victory wasn't Thomas's death or the network's destruction. It was the knowledge that children like Emma would grow up in a world where predators couldn't hide behind wealth and influence, where communities would choose uncomfortable truths over comfortable lies. The torn doll that had started this journey waited for Emma's return, its button eyes reflecting the morning light that marked the end of Cedar Ridge's longest night and the beginning of a future where innocence would be protected rather than exploited. The new memorial plaque was installed 6 months after the federal operation brought down Thomas Brennan's network, positioned prominently in the courthouse where Emma had first sought help and where Clay had promised to protect her from monsters that had hidden in plain sight for far too long. Cast in bronze with letters deep enough to last generations, it read, "In memory of Sarah Hartwell and all survivors of child abuse, your courage makes others safe." Emma stood beside Clay as they unveiled the memorial, her small hand warm in his while her other arm clutched the torn doll that had become a symbol of survival and healing. At 8 years old now, she was thriving in a loving adoptive family that understood the importance of patience, therapy, and the kind of unconditional support that helped traumatized children learn to trust the world again. "Sheriff Clay," she said quietly, her voice stronger than it had been that terrible morning when she'd whispered her secrets on the courthouse steps. "Do you think Sarah knows that we stopped the bad men?" Clay knelt beside her, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through courthouse windows, understanding that some questions deserved the most honest answers a person could give. "I think she does, sweetheart. I think she's proud of how brave you were when it mattered most. And I think she's happy that other children don't have to be scared the way she was scared." The federal prosecutions had resulted in convictions that would keep network members in prison for the rest of their lives, while asset forfeiture proceedings had generated over $50 million in victim compensation funds. 43 children had been rescued from active abuse situations, and hundreds of adult survivors had finally received acknowledgement and support for trauma they'd carried in silence for decades. Cedar Ridge itself had undergone a transformation that went beyond the obvious changes. New businesses moving into properties previously owned by Brennan Enterprises, fresh leadership in organizations that had been controlled by network allies, and a community conversation about protecting children that replaced the willful blindness that had enabled predators for generations. Clay remained sheriff, his reputation enhanced rather than damaged by his pursuit of justice against overwhelming odds. The investigation had revealed that his integrity and persistence had been precisely the qualities that made him effective at protecting the vulnerable, and voters had rewarded his courage with unanimous re-election and the kind of community support that made difficult decisions easier to bear. Mayor Jim Caldwell had been replaced by Sarah Martinez, Betty's daughter from the diner, who'd campaigned on a platform of transparency and child protection that reflected Cedar Ridge's commitment to confronting rather than concealing uncomfortable truths. Her first official act had been establishing a victims advocacy program funded by seized Brennan assets. Deputy Maria Santos had been promoted to Chief Deputy, her experience with urban crime patterns proving invaluable as Cedar Ridge developed new protocols for identifying and investigating abuse cases. She'd also been instrumental in training programs that helped other rural law enforcement agencies recognize the signs of systematic predation that networks like Thomas's relied upon. Dr. Rebecca Hayes had returned to her real identity as a federal agent, but not before establishing a community health clinic that provided specialized services for trauma survivors and their families. Her 15 years undercover had given her unique insights into rural healthcare needs, and she'd used those insights to create programs that would outlast her official assignment. The church had faced its own reckoning, with new leadership that emphasized protecting children rather than protecting reputations. Pastor Williams had been replaced by a younger minister whose first sermon had addressed the difference between forgiveness and accountability, between redemption and enabling evil to continue unchallenged. Clay spent Sunday afternoons with Emma and her adoptive family, relationships that had grown from professional necessity into something approaching extended family. Emma called him Uncle Clay now, a title that carried both honor and responsibility, the chance to be the kind of protective adult figure she'd needed during her darkest moments. "Tell me about the case you're working on," Emma said during one of their regular visits, her curiosity about law enforcement reflecting a child's natural interest in her personal hero's daily work. She was smart enough to understand that being a sheriff meant protecting people, brave enough to want to help with that protection, and resilient enough to channel her own trauma into empathy for others. Clay smiled at her question, understanding that their relationship had become one of the most rewarding aspects of his career. "Well, Deputy Santos and I are helping a family whose dog went missing. We think we know where he is, and we're planning a rescue operation that involves sneaking up on Mrs. Henderson's chicken coop where he's probably hiding from the rooster." Emma giggled at the idea of official law enforcement resources being devoted to dog versus rooster conflicts, but Clay understood that every case mattered to someone, every problem deserved attention, and every person who asked for help deserved to be heard and believed. Margaret had returned to her volunteer work with renewed purpose, focusing on programs that supported families in crisis and children who needed advocates. Her cross-stitch now decorated the walls of the new Victims Services office, depicting scenes of hope and healing that reminded visitors that survival was possible, that healing was achievable, that communities could choose courage over comfort. The evening ritual had evolved as well. Clay and Margaret still spent quiet time in his study, but now Emma's drawings were displayed alongside Sarah's letter and case files from current investigations. The torn doll sat in a place of honor, its button eyes reflecting the lamplight as Clay reviewed daily reports and planned community outreach programs. "She's going to be fine," Margaret said one evening, watching Emma play in their backyard while her adoptive parents visited over coffee and conversation. "Children are remarkably resilient when they have adults who believe them and protect them." Clay nodded, understanding that Emma's recovery was both miraculous and ordinary, the natural result of providing traumatized children with safety, support, and the kind of patient love that allowed healing to occur. She would always carry scars from what Thomas Brennan had done to her, but those scars would be part of a larger story about survival, courage, and the adults who'd chosen to fight for justice, regardless of personal cost. The torn doll that had started the entire investigation now resided in Emma's bedroom, but it visited the sheriff's office regularly when Emma came to town for appointments or social visits. Clay kept a small frame on his desk with the crayon drawing Emma had created during her federal protection. The picture of a sheriff and a little girl standing together in sunshine, protected by adults who understood that some promises were worth any sacrifice to keep. Cedar Ridge faced its future with clear eyes and honest hearts, understanding that protecting children required constant vigilance, that predators would always seek new ways to exploit vulnerability, and that communities had a choice between comfortable lies and difficult truths. They'd chosen truth with all its complications and challenges because they'd learned that the alternative was unconscionable. Sarah Hartwell's name was engraved in bronze now, her memory honored by a community that had finally found the courage to confront the evil that had destroyed her childhood and ended her life. But more importantly, her death had meaning. It had motivated a brother to seek justice, enabled a federal investigation that saved dozens of children, and inspired a community to choose protection over reputation. Emma's torn doll bore witness to it all, a small survivor's companion that had traveled from courthouse steps to federal safe houses to a loving home where children could play without fear. Its button eyes had seen the worst of human nature and the best of human courage, had accompanied a brave little girl through darkness toward light, had remained faithful when the world seemed full of monsters who wore respectable faces. The memorial plaque caught the afternoon sunlight as Clay and Emma walked past it after their weekly ice cream tradition, its bronze letters promising that future generations would remember the cost of silence and the value of speaking truth to power. Children would grow up in Cedar Ridge, knowing that adults could be trusted to protect them, that secrets didn't have to be carried alone, that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible. Clay's badge reflected the same sunlight, tarnished by 23 years of service, but polished by the knowledge that he'd honored his oath to protect and serve, that he'd stood between good people and those who would hurt them, that he'd finally become the lawman his father had taught him to be, and the protector his sister had needed him to become. Emma skipped beside him, her laughter carrying across the courthouse square, where she'd first whispered terrible secrets. To a sheriff who'd promised to keep her safe. The promise had been kept, the monsters had been defeated, and a little girl who'd trusted adults to protect her had been proven right in that trust. The torn doll bounced gently in Emma's arms as they walked toward home, its silent witness to courage and healing complete. Some stories ended with justice served, evil defeated, and innocence protected. This was one of those stories, written in bronze letters that would endure long after the last survivor had healed, the last predator had faced accountability, and the last child had learned to trust the world again. In Cedar Ridge, the sun set on a community that had chosen difficult truths over comfortable lies, protection over reputation, justice over convenience. It was a choice that had cost them everything they thought they valued, and given them everything that actually mattered. The knowledge that children could grow up safe, that predators would face consequences, and that sometimes, when good people found the courage to act, evil could be defeated completely and permanently. The memorial plaque would outlast them all, its bronze letters proclaiming that Sarah Hartwell's death had meaning, Emma's courage had power, and Sheriff Clay Hartwell's promise had been kept. Some victories echoed through generations, and this was one of them.